Back in 1857, there was this house owned by Margaret Whitmore, and it was like the fancy house in Malheur County, South Carolina. Picture a big two-story plantation house with white pillars and a porch that wraps all the way around, looking out over cotton fields that go all the way to the PD River. It looked like the perfect picture book Southern house. But get this, it was about to become the center of one of the most shocking true stories ever found about American slavery. Margaret Whitmore was 34 years old, and she got the plantation from her husband when he died, 3 years before this story starts. Everybody in the county thought she was so polite and generous, always giving money to the local Methodist church. She had 7 enslaved people working in her house. One of them was a young woman named Delilah Hayes, 22 years old, and she was so smart and so calm that she became Mrs. Whitmore's personal helper. The first little clue that something weird was going on came from someone you'd never expect. A preacher named Reverend Thomas Caldwell wrote something in his own journal, and it turned out to matter a lot later. Every month when he visited the Whitmore house to say a blessing, he noticed Delilah had this strange habit. She'd arrange flowers in the living room in a certain pattern that seemed to mean something, even though nobody knew what. The flower stems were always grouped in 3s, 5s, and 7s. When people asked her why, Delilah would just say it made Mrs. Whitmore happy. What Reverend Caldwell had no clue about was that Delilah had built her own secret code to send messages, and it was about to blow the lid off one of the biggest secrets in the whole county. Over years of watching closely and being super clever, she made a way to record information that her owner thought would stay hidden forever. On the outside, the Whitmore place looked like typical Southern hospitality. Mrs. Whitmore threw dinner parties all the time for rich local folks and gave a lot to church stuff. Guests always talked about how well-trained her house staff was, especially how smoothly Delilah ran things, but nobody noticed the sneaky little patterns Delilah put into everything she did. The flowers were just one part of a much bigger system. She'd fold blankets and sheets a certain way, put books on shelves in an order only she understood, and move furniture with tiny little shifts that looked like accidents but were totally on purpose. Every little tweak, every little arrangement was really part of a system that was quietly writing down the truth about what really happened in that house after the guests went home. Mrs. Whitmore's reputation around town was spotless. People said she was kind to her enslaved workers, gave tons to charity, and lived by her Christian values. According to the county courthouse records, she'd never gotten in trouble for how she treated her property. The church records showed she went every week and gave a lot of money. To anyone looking from outside, Margaret Whitmore was the perfect picture of a proper Southern lady, but Delilah saw a totally different side of her. Behind closed doors, especially on long winter nights when no guests were coming, Mrs. Whitmore would turn into someone else completely, and Delilah started writing that down using her secret arranging system. What Delilah built took serious brain power and memory. She gave number values to different objects around the house and to where they were placed. A book turned with the spine facing in meant one thing, spine facing out meant something else. Candles set at certain heights on their holders stood for different kinds of information. Even the way she set up Mrs. Whitmore's stuff in her bedroom followed this same secret code. Through all this, Delilah started recording a pattern of behavior that was nothing like what the town believed about Margaret Whitmore. The arrangements recorded times of yelling, threats, and mean mind games that happened when nobody else was watching. Even worse, the coded arrangements started showing how Mrs. Whitmore treated the other workers in the house too, showing a pattern of control and punishment way beyond what was normal, even for that time. The big break in figuring out Delilah's system came from someone nobody expected. In spring of 1858, Mrs. Whitmore's nephew, Jonathan Whitmore, came from Charleston to help sort out some family stuff. He was 26, had just finished college at the College of Charleston, and he loved math and patterns. During the 3 weeks he stayed, he started noticing how the house was always arranged in certain consistent ways. Unlike other visitors who just figured it was good training, Jonathan spotted the math hidden inside Delilah's work. He noticed the arrangements changed every day but followed hidden rules that pointed to something planned. His math background let him see what everybody else had missed. This wasn't random tidying, it was a clever secret code. Jonathan got curious and started writing down the arrangements himself. He drew pictures of where things were placed, wrote down the number patterns in the flowers, and tracked how things changed day by day. What he found showed not just intelligence, but a real reason behind it all. The moment everything clicked came through a sad event that showed the full truth about Mrs. Whitmore. In late May of 1858, an enslaved woman named Ruth Thompson, who worked in the kitchen, was found dead in her room. The doctor, Henry Morrison, wrote it down as a heart problem, but Delilah's arrangements in the days after Ruth died told a very different story. The way things were placed around the house that week formed a pattern that Jonathan started to figure out. Using his math skills, he began to understand that the arrangements matched up with specific events and times. The flower groups, the book positions, the candle heights, all were pieces of a timeline that recorded what really happened in that house. What Jonathan learned by reading Delilah's code showed that Ruth Thompson's death wasn't natural at all. The arrangements pointed to a fight between Mrs. Whitmore and Ruth over some missing silverware from the dining room. According to the coded record, Mrs. Whitmore accused Ruth of stealing and punished her so badly it killed her. The pattern suggested Ruth had been locked in a cellar under the kitchen for days with no food or water. Delilah's system went way beyond simple note-taking. She built several layers of meaning into her arrangements, letting her record not just what happened, but why and what came after. For example, where Mrs. Whitmore's Bible sat on her nightstand matched up with certain kinds of punishment given to the staff. The angle of the curtains showed how bad Mrs. Whitmore's mood was and how likely she was to turn violent. As Jonathan understood more and more, he was filled with horror at what he was uncovering. The coded arrangements recorded years of abuse that had been hidden from everyone outside. They showed a pattern of mind games, physical punishment, and cruelty that didn't match Mrs. Whitmore's public image at all. Jonathan now faced a tough choice, moral and legal, about what to do with what he knew. Back in 1858 South Carolina, anything an enslaved person said meant nothing in court against a white property owner. Even if Delilah agreed to talk about what she'd seen, her words wouldn't count for anything legally. The clever coded arrangements, no matter how smart they were, would just get laughed off as made-up stories from an ignorant slave, according to any judge back then. But Jonathan had something that gave the accusations weight. He'd seen Mrs. Whitmore's true colors with his own eyes. During his stay, he watched how she treated her workers when she thought no one was looking. He saw the fear in the eyes of the enslaved workers whenever she walked into a room. Most importantly, he witnessed something that proved Delilah's coded records were accurate. On the evening of June 2, 1858, Jonathan saw how Mrs. Whitmore reacted to a small accident at dinner. Delilah had knocked over a water glass while serving. Mrs. Whitmore's reaction was fast and violent. She slapped Delilah so hard across the face that she fell to the ground, then went on a nasty verbal attack that showed just how much she hated the woman who served her every day. What made this moment so important was that Jonathan got to watch how Delilah recorded the event through her arrangement system afterward. The next morning, the way things were placed around the house had changed to match exactly what Jonathan had seen happen. This proof that the system worked gave him confidence that everything else it recorded was true too. Carrying this heavy knowledge started messing with Jonathan's health and mood. He couldn't sleep, haunted by what he now knew. The arrangements didn't just show single moments of cruelty, they showed a pattern of abuse going on for years. They recorded the deaths of at least 3 other enslaved people under conditions that looked far from natural. The coded arrangements also revealed something else that really shook Jonathan, evidence that Mrs. Whitmore wasn't acting alone. The system showed visits from other plantation owners in the area who joined in on what could only be called organized torture sessions. The arrangements showed these meetings happened every month, always when no real guests were expected, and always ended badly for the household staff. The names recorded through Delilah's system included some of the most respected people in Malheur County. Colonel William Harrison, Judge Robert Stackhouse, and Dr. Henry Morrison were all named as taking part in these gatherings, according to the coded arrangements. Learning that the very officials who were supposed to keep law and order were actually part of this explained why the abuse had gone unnoticed for so long. Jonathan's digging into Delilah's arrangements had uncovered not just one cruel person, but a whole organized network of sick behavior among the county's rich and powerful. The clever cover-up, the way deaths kept getting written off as natural, and the total lack of any real investigation, it all suddenly made sense once you saw it as one coordinated plan to protect everyone involved. The question of what to do with this knowledge really tortured Jonathan. Confronting Mrs. Whitmore straight up wouldn't fix anything and would probably bring terrible punishment down on Delilah and the rest of the staff. The legal system was compromised because the very officials in charge were part of what was being uncovered. The whole social and political setup of the county made any normal path to justice impossible. During his last week there, Jonathan made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to work through a broken system, he decided to write down everything he'd learned so he could expose the network through people outside Malheur County. He started making detailed notes of Delilah's system, turning the coded arrangements into written descriptions of what they showed. Working secretly in his room in the early morning hours, Jonathan wrote out years of hidden history. The arrangements showed abuse going all the way back to when Mrs. Whitmore first married her late husband. They recorded the deaths of enslaved people whose disappearances had been blamed on running away. They gave proof of a network of rich planters who met regularly to do things that would shock even the toughest people. The cleverness of the abuse matched the cleverness of the cover-up. The arrangements showed how deaths were staged to look natural, how bodies were disposed of, and how official records were faked. They showed Dr. Morrison's role in writing fake death certificates, and Judge Stackhouse's role in shutting down any questions that came up. The system exposed corruption that reached all the way to the top of the county government. On his last morning at the plantation, Jonathan talked to Delilah to check that he understood her system right. They talked quietly before dawn in the kitchen while everyone else was asleep. What he learned in that short talk was even worse than his worst fears about what the arrangements showed. Delilah confirmed that the coded system really was a record of what happened in the plantation house, but she also told him it was only one small piece of a much bigger network. Other enslaved people on plantations all around the county had built their own similar systems. Information was being shared and coordinated across many places. What Jonathan had found wasn't just one woman writing down abuse, it was part of a huge secret information network that had been running for years. This news was staggering. Enslaved people had built their own system for gathering evidence and passing along information, completely hidden from the people who owned them. They'd been collecting proof, coordinating with each other, and building a full record of the crimes being done to them. Delilah's flower arrangements were just the one small visible part of a much bigger underground information network across the whole region. When Jonathan left the Whitmore plantation, it kicked off a risky mission. He carried with him detailed notes copied from Delilah's coded records, plus his own memories of the abuse he'd seen. He headed to Charleston, hoping to find someone in charge who wasn't tangled up in the corrupt network he'd found in Malheur County. But the network reached further than Jonathan expected. Just days after he got to Charleston, some people who somehow already knew about his investigation reached out to him. The message was clear: his digging into Malheur County business wasn't welcome and could be dangerous. They hinted he'd be happier if he just moved to a different state altogether. That threat convinced Jonathan that going through legal channels directly wasn't going to work, but he refused to just throw away the evidence he'd gathered. Instead, he wrote everything down in a detailed account and left it with a trusted friend in Charleston, with instructions to keep it safe and maybe publish it later, whenever the time might finally be right for justice. Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore plantation, Delilah kept recording events with her arrangement system, but she also started changing her methods now that she knew Jonathan had cracked her code. The arrangements got more hidden, the patterns more complicated. She'd learned that other people could understand her system too, which opened up new ways to communicate. The summer of 1858 passed quietly at the plantation. Mrs. Whitmore kept up her public act as a giving, Christian Southern lady, while her staff lived in fear of her private fits of rage. The monthly meetings of county officials kept happening, and Delilah kept recording them with more and more advanced patterns. The big breakthrough came in September when Delilah connected with an unexpected friend. Marcus Williams, a free black carpenter who sometimes did repair work on plantations, had noticed the patterns during his visits to different properties. He was smart and educated enough to recognize that what he was seeing wasn't random. Unlike Jonathan, who'd stumbled onto the code by accident, Marcus went straight up to Delilah to ask about it. What grew between Delilah and Marcus opened up new ways to record and maybe expose the whole abuse network. Marcus had connections across the region that went way beyond enslaved people. Being a free man of color gave him access to communities and information Delilah never could have reached on her own. And most importantly, he had ties to abolitionists up north who might actually be able to do something with this information. Through Marcus, Delilah's coded arrangements began reaching a much wider audience. The information got written down and passed along secret networks until it reached sympathetic people in Philadelphia and Boston. Even experienced abolitionists who'd heard tons of plantation abuse stories were impressed by how detailed and careful the documentation was. The organized nature of the evidence, plus the discovery of a whole network of people involved, made this case one of a kind in their experience. but exposing the network turned out to be way more dangerous than anyone thought. In October of 1858, Marcus Williams vanished while traveling between plantations for a regular work job. His body turned up days later near the PD River. Officials called it an accidental drowning, but the details said otherwise. Marcus's death sent a loud, clear warning to anyone thinking about messing with how things were run in Marlborough County. But it also backfired in one way: it pushed others to actually take action. The network of enslaved people who'd built their own communication systems realized that just quietly writing things down wasn't enough anymore. It was time to do more. The winter of 1858 brought more advanced coordination in the underground information network. Delilah's arrangement system grew to include new tricks, letting her communicate even more complicated things. How farm tools were placed, how kitchen items were arranged, even how clothes were hung out to dry all started carrying secret meanings, readable only to those who understood the system. The information passed through these networks showed just how big the organized abuse really was across the county. Many plantations were involved, dozens of officials took part. And the cover-up reached into banks, churches, and government offices. The enslaved population had built solid proof of a conspiracy that reached the very top of local society. Abolitionist networks up north reacted fast but had to stay very secretive. Plans started forming for a coordinated push to expose the Marlborough County network, but Marcus Williams's tragic death showed just how risky any direct move could be. Whatever they did next would need very careful planning to avoid the same fate. The chance to act finally came from an unexpected place. In early 1859, a young reporter named William Patterson came to South Carolina to write articles about plantation life for a Boston newspaper. His job was to describe the daily routines and social setup of Southern farming. He had no idea he was about to become the key to exposing one of the most organized abuse conspiracies in American history. Patterson's first approach to his assignment was pretty ordinary. He set up visits to several plantations, interviewed owners and overseers, and watched how the fields and households were run. His early articles for the Boston Herald described plantation farming in that same cool, detached tone typical of Northern journalism back then. But Patterson had traits that made him sharper than the average visitor to Southern plantations. He'd studied math and science, which helped him spot patterns other people might miss. Even more important, his reporter's training taught him to look past appearances and question official stories about events. During his visit to the Whitmore plantation in February 1859, Patterson came across Delilah's arrangement system. Unlike earlier visitors who just wrote it off as good training, Patterson noticed the mathematical thinking behind the patterns. His investigation into what these arrangements meant would end up exposing the entire network. It took Patterson several weeks of careful watching and thinking to crack Delilah's code. Working from the notes Jonathan Whitmore had left with his friend in Charleston, Patterson figured out the basic rules behind the arrangement system. But Delilah had kept improving and complicating the code since Jonathan left, so the current arrangements were trickier than what had been recorded before. The big breakthrough came when Patterson realized the arrangements weren't just recording single events, they were building a full, ongoing history. Each day's patterns added onto earlier ones to build a running story that stretched back years. This historical record was as detailed as any written document and gave a level of detail that couldn't have been captured any other way. What Patterson found by decoding the arrangements was proof of murder, torture, and conspiracy involving some of the most well-known people in South Carolina. It wasn't just showing individual acts of cruelty. It showed an organized network that operated with the knowledge and protection of local officials. It was all so shocking that Patterson at first wondered if he'd really understood the code correctly. He got confirmation by watching current events and seeing how they later showed up in Delilah's patterns. When Mrs. Whitmore got bad business news in early March, she reacted with a violent outburst against her staff. Patterson witnessed it himself and then watched how it got coded into the arrangement patterns afterward, proving the system really was a reliable record. Deciding what to do with this information brought Patterson both career and moral struggles. This story could make his career explode in a good way, but he also cared deeply about keeping the people who gave him this information safe. Exposing it too soon or too carelessly could get his sources killed. Patterson's plan was to build a smart strategy that would expose the network while still protecting his sources. Working with abolitionist contacts up north, he arranged for his findings to be published in several newspapers across different states all at once. Releasing it everywhere at the same time would make it much harder for the people involved to hide the story or take revenge on specific people. The investigation needed several more months to finish. Patterson stayed in South Carolina through the summer of 1859, gathering more evidence and double-checking what was in the coded arrangements. His research showed the Malheur County network was actually part of a bigger regional conspiracy stretching into North Carolina and Georgia. The cleverness of the cover-up matched the cleverness of the evidence built against it. The enslaved people had recorded not just the crimes themselves, but also how those crimes were hidden. They noted the fake death certificates, the bribed officials, and the scared-off witnesses. The records painted a full picture of how such organized abuse could go unnoticed for so many years. The final part of Patterson's investigation was checking on how the network's activities were going right then. In August 1859, he managed to watch one of the monthly meetings Delilah had been recording all along. Hidden in the woods around the Whitmore plantation, Patterson saw things happen that confirmed the coded records were accurate and proved the conspiracy was still going on. When Patterson published his big story in September 1859, it caused exactly the stir he expected. Newspapers all over the North ran the story, and the evidence was detailed enough to convince even doubtful readers. The careful coded documentation gave the story a level of believability that older plantation abuse stories often hadn't had, but South Carolina officials responded fast and predictably. Patterson got arrested for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Mrs. Whitmore and the other people named denied everything and claimed the coded arrangements were just made-up stories from enslaved workers trying to cause trouble. Officials dismissed the whole story as Northern propaganda meant to trash the South's reputation. The legal process that followed showed how impossible it was to get real justice through normal channels. Despite tons of evidence, no charges were ever filed against anyone involved. Enslaved witnesses weren't allowed to testify, and Patterson's own observations were dismissed as biased reporting from a Northern troublemaker. The case closed within months with zero legal consequences for anyone in the conspiracy. Still, the exposure had effects beyond the courtroom. The detailed proof of organized abuse and the reveal of a whole network damaged the reputations of everyone involved. Several of the accused saw their social and business relationships take a hit because of the allegations. More importantly, the exposure broke up the network's operations and made it impossible for things to keep going the way they had before. What happened to the people who gave the evidence was mixed. Delilah Hayes and several other enslaved people disappeared from the Whitmore plantation soon after the story came out. Official records say they were sold to plantations in other states, but abolitionist sources suggest they might have been helped to escape to freedom through underground railroad connections built during the investigation. Mrs. Whitmore kept living at the plantation until she died in 1862, but her standing in the community never bounced back after the accusations. The monthly meetings stopped, and several of the officials involved either retired or moved away. Even though legal justice never happened, the exposure did succeed in breaking up the network and stopping its activities. The coded arrangement system Delilah Hayes created is one of the most impressive examples of resistance and record-keeping in the whole history of American slavery. The math skill and thoroughness behind her work matches trained historians and journalists. That she kept such detailed records while living under constant watching and the threat of violence shows real courage and intelligence. The bigger picture here, the network of communication systems built by enslaved people across Malheur County, suggests that our history of plantation life might be missing a lot. The fact that enslaved people could record, coordinate, and preserve proof of their own experiences shows they had way more power and brainpower than the usual history books give them credit for. This case also shows how much systematic abuse could be hidden when people in power worked together. Judges, doctors, and other officials being involved in both committing crimes and covering them up shows how corruption in the system could make real justice impossible through normal legal means. The conspiracy needed not just individual cruelty, but real coordination across many levels of local government and society. The technical cleverness of Delilah's system raises the question of what other historical evidence might be hidden in unusual forms we haven't found yet. Being able to hide complex information inside everyday household arrangements suggests important historical facts might exist in ways that regular historical research hasn't recognized. The bravery shown by everyone who helped record and expose this network reminds us how strong the human drive to resist can be, even under horribly oppressive conditions. People risking their lives to preserve proof of injustice and demand accountability shows one of the most admirable sides of human nature when facing organized evil. Years later, in 1867, during Reconstruction, more evidence of the Malheur County network turned up when federal investigators looked through local records as part of a bigger effort to understand slavery in South Carolina. They found mentions of the coded arrangement systems in documents kept safe by abolitionist groups, adding more proof to what Patterson had already documented. But by then, most of the people involved in the conspiracy had died or moved away. The chance for legal punishment had passed, and Reconstruction was focused on rebuilding, not punishing old crimes. The case became a footnote in history books instead of a source of justice for the people who'd suffered. The records left by Delilah Hayes and the other enslaved people in the information network eventually ended up in archives kept by Northern abolitionist groups. These records give one of the most detailed pictures of plantation life from the point of view of the people who actually lived it. But because so much of it is in code, historians have had a hard time fully understanding and using it to fill in the historical record. The story of the Malheur County case matters beyond just its own history. It shows how important it is to recognize other kinds of record-keeping and resistance that don't look like typical historical sources. How advanced the enslaved population's response was challenges old assumptions about literacy, intelligence, and power that have shaped how we understand slavery. This case also reminds us how institutions could block justice even with strong evidence right there. Local officials being involved in both committing and covering up crimes made normal legal solutions impossible and forced people to find other ways to expose the truth and demand accountability. This pattern matters for understanding other historical cases where organized abuse got protected by corrupt institutions. The creativity Delilah Hayes showed in building her coded system is a remarkable example of clever thinking under terrible limits. That she could build a full record-keeping system using only what was available inside a plantation household shows how humans can innovate and resist even under the harshest conditions. In the end, this is the story of how a beautiful enslaved woman's seemingly silly little habit actually revealed the truth her owner was desperately trying to hide, and it stands as proof of how powerful human intelligence and courage can be against organized injustice. Coded arrangements, which looked to casual visitors like just good training, were actually a smart historical record that preserved proof of crimes that otherwise would have stayed hidden forever. The quiet that followed the exposure of the Malheur County network wasn't the quiet of things being fixed, it was the quiet of a society that wasn't ready to face what had really been uncovered. The evidence was overwhelming, the record-keeping was smart, and the courage of everyone who provided it was amazing. But the same institutions that had protected the abuse stayed exactly in place, so real accountability never happened. Today, the documents saved from Delilah Hayes' coded system are still kept in archives run by historical groups in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. Researchers are still working on fully cracking the math patterns that recorded years of hidden history. Every new discovery about her system reveals more details about life under slavery that challenge the usual history books and give insight into the lives of people whose voices got left out of official records. The truth that came out of those carefully placed flowers, precisely arranged books, and deliberately tilted candles was this: systematic evil could be documented, exposed, and stopped, even when normal paths to justice were corrupt or unreachable. The courage and cleverness shown by the people who built and kept up these record-keeping systems remind us that the human spirit's ability to resist can't be wiped out, even under the harshest conditions. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all, that such advanced systems of record-keeping and resistance were even necessary, that the very institutions meant to stop this kind of organized abuse were instead part of covering it up. And that justice could only happen because of the extraordinary courage and intelligence of the very people who had the most to lose by telling the truth. The echoes of those coded arrangements still ripple through American history, reminding us that the official record might not tell the whole story, that people who look powerless might have had forms of power and resistance we've never fully recognized, and that chasing justice sometimes takes methods and bravery that go way beyond normal legal and social paths. The quiet that followed the exposure of the Malheur County network wasn't the quiet of things being fixed, it was the quiet of a society that wasn't ready to face what had really been uncovered. The evidence was overwhelming, the record-keeping was smart, and the courage of everyone who provided it was amazing. But the same institutions that had protected the abuse stayed exactly in place, so real accountability never happened. In 1863, nearly 4 years after Patterson's big story came out, the Civil War brought federal troops into Marlborough County. Among the papers taken from abandoned plantation houses were pieces of Delilah's coded arrangements, which had been kept up by later household staff who'd picked up parts of her system. These pieces gave even more proof that the network had really existed and operated. Margaret Whitmore died at her home in February 1862, said to be from pneumonia. But people who knew about Delilah's record-keeping system noticed that the woman who had tormented so many people had died alone, abandoned by the very community that once praised her charity work. The fear and loneliness she'd forced on others had, in the end, become her own fate. The plantation house sat empty for years after Mrs. Whitmore died. Locals said they heard strange sounds coming from the building on quiet evenings, not ghosts, just old wood settling and wind whispering through rooms where terrible secrets had once been carefully recorded through the arrangement of everyday objects. In 1868, during Reconstruction, a freedman named Samuel Hayes, no relation to Delilah, bought the property. Despite sharing her last name, Samuel found several items hidden in the walls while fixing up the house. Small bundles of dried flowers arranged in specific patterns, pieces of paper covered in math notes, and a wooden box holding what looked like a rough but organized calendar marked with symbols matching Delilah's code. These finds gave the final proof of just how advanced and far-reaching the record-keeping network had really been, operating in secret for years. The hidden items were basically a backup system Delilah had built to save the most important evidence in case her main arrangement method ever got discovered or messed with. The wooden box also held one more thing, a single piece of paper with words written carefully by hand. The message was short but powerful. Truth finds a way to survive even when those who speak it cannot. That note, kept safe in the archives of the Freedman's Bureau, stands as the final proof of one of the most remarkable examples of resistance and record-keeping in American history. Delilah Hayes hadn't just survived being enslaved, she'd built a legacy that would outlast both the people who tormented her and the whole system that had protected them. The truth she uncovered through her seemingly simple arrangements had exposed a network of organized evil that reached the very top of local society. Even though real legal justice never happened, the exposure had broken up the conspiracy and stopped it from continuing. Even more important, her methods proved that even under the worst conditions, human intelligence and courage could find ways to record truth and save evidence for the future. The code she built was simple enough to keep up under constant watching, yet clever enough to preserve years of detailed history. Her legacy lives on, not just in what got revealed about the Marlborough County network, but in proving that people who seemed powerless actually had real power and the determination to use it for justice. Today, historians keep studying the pieces of Delilah's system that survived. Every new thing they learn about her methods reveals more about the lives of people whose voices got left out of official records. Her work stands as a monument to how humans can resist and to how truth can survive even the most determined attempts to bury it. This beautiful enslaved woman, whose silly little habit had seemed like nothing more than a thing for neatness, had actually built one of the most advanced systems of historical record-keeping and resistance in American history. Her legacy reminds us that truth, just like the carefully arranged flowers she used to hide it in, has a way of blooming even in the darkest places. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that evil, no matter how carefully it's organized or how well it's protected by powerful institutions, can never completely wipe out a person's ability to record the truth, save the evidence, and make sure injustice eventually comes to light. The arrangements have long since been messed up, the flowers have dried up and died, and the books have been moved around. But the truth they recorded still echoes through history, proof of the amazing courage and intelligence of a woman who found a way to make her voice heard across the centuries, speaking truth to power just by placing objects exactly where they needed to be.